Good afternoon, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute. You have joined us for an introduction to careers in environmental law and policy. My name is Caitlin McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at ELI. We're delighted to welcome everyone to this very first seminar kicking off ELI's annual Summer School Seminar Series, and I would encourage you to join us every Tuesday for summer school. For more information, please see the events page of our website, eli.org. I will note that every summer school seminar will be taking place by webinar only this summer to ensure the safety of our panelists, participants, and staff. Thank you so much for your understanding and for joining us. At the end of today's panel, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please do submit your questions using GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send your questions as soon as you think of them. I would also like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their leadership to summer school. While I will introduce them briefly, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. Each of our panelists today will have about 10 to 12 minutes to introduce themselves, their work, and career journeys. Then we will save some time at the end for an open discussion, question, and answer session. To begin, this session offers the opportunity for budding environmental professionals to ask questions and interact with leading experts from a wide array of professional backgrounds in the environmental law and policy field. In my role as the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at ELI, I have the immense honor of working with these outstanding leaders on the panel today, as well as remarkable folks leading interesting and innovative careers throughout the environmental sector. With so many choices of career paths within the environmental field, we hope this session provides you with useful and informative insight into how to navigate this diverse and rapidly growing career space. And so I am delighted to welcome our panelists and share their diverse experiences with us. First, we will have Dannique Aalbu, a biologist at the California Department of Transportation. Following her, we will have Dr. Lisa Benjamin, Assistant Professor of Law at Lewis and Clark Law School. Next, we'll have our perspective from the corporate sector with Marissa Blackshire, Senior Director of Environmental Compliance and EHS at Bloom Energy. Following Marissa, we welcome Loy-T Chang, who will explore her experience as a transactional lawyer as counsel at Davis Polk. Then moving into the NGO space, we'll welcome Erin Eastwood, Program Director of the National Ocean Protection Coalition. To introduce the think tank world, we welcome Ruth Greenspan-Bell, a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And finally, we welcome Dr. Kristen Robrock, who serves as managing engineer at Exponent. We're so thrilled to have such a diversity of professionals with us today. And with that, I will turn things over to Dannique. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Dannique, and as Caitlin said, I work currently as a biologist for Caltrans, or the California Department of Transportation. And yeah, this isn't, my first job. I'm just going to go through like our overarching kind of questions and let you know kind of what my path was getting to where I am now. But it really comes down to like my love for being outdoors and just having always had a love for science. So from a young age, like I always knew that I wanted to work in some realm of science. And when I first went to college, I started studying environmental engineering actually, and I took a lot of coursework in various areas, not just in engineering and physics and math, but I spent time taking electives that just kind of to see what where my interests lied, and I really enjoyed an environmental biology class that I took as an undergrad. That was one of my favorite courses, and it kind of got me interested. It was my first introduction to kind of the ecology world, and so got me interested in studying that. And when I ended up finishing my undergrad, I actually was in the earth science department with a minor in ecology. And so I had, a lot of background in soils, but then a lot of background also in like ecosystem management. And I knew that I wanted to pursue some work in a realm that would allow me to spend a good amount of time in the field. And so my first real job was with the National Park Service, so government job. And so I worked in the field hydrology department there in Yosemite, so in the Sierra Nevada, and got to spend a lot of time working on various research projects, doing a lot of like stream gauging and monitoring of water quality. We had a couple different projects going on, but kind of the main project, I worked there for 4 seasons, and one of the main things we were studying was how backpackers and stock use might be affecting water quality in the park. I also did a project, we were aging the water in one of the large watersheds in the park in the Merced River to try and understand how groundwater might influence stream flow in like late summer months, and kind of answer some questions about where water comes from in kind of the late summer months. And so that was a really amazing time that I had working outside, and it kind of got me interested in, going back to school and trying to just kind of diversify my background a little bit. I ended up going to a graduate program in environmental science and management in Santa Barbara, California. And my program really focused, going into graduate school, like I was, thinking I was going to get a lot more technical skills. I knew that I was going to dive more into, modeling and statistics. But the one thing that I really didn't expect going into it was that really a lot of what working in the environmental field is about is communication. So really graduate school is helping me become a better communicator. And as a scientist and working in the environmental field, that's one of our strongest tools that we have, especially with, our changing climate and all of the issues that we have going on. Like that is really our, where power lies, is our ability to communicate and help people understand like why these issues are important. So in graduate school, in my environmental science and management program, my focus was in water resource management initially, as I was kind of going down that hydrology kind of path, but it ended up, I took a class studying conservation management, and I really enjoyed it. And so again, I kind of did a little bit of a side turn towards the ecology realm, and ended up kind of doing like a dual focus in water resource management and conservation planning. And between my 2 years of being in graduate school, I took a job in the private sector at a consulting firm, and they actually brought me on as a biologist. I had enough background in field work and was able to, kind of try something new. So that was a really kind of, shift for me, working out and doing field work in biology, but then also being able to kind of connect it to our environmental laws and policies that surround, all the protections that we have that, inform all of the work and data collection that we do. So that was when, so that was when I was in graduate school. And I would say that really how I came to work at Caltrans, it's for me, a lot of it's really a lifestyle choice. I know that I'm very happy when I get to spend time outside. I love being outside and studying nature firsthand, I really love data collection. So for me, that like having that be a piece of my job is really important to me. And so I would say that, as a biologist at Caltrans, a lot of my work first kind of when I get a new project, the first thing I do is kind of scope what types of, environmental resources could potentially be impacted by the project. And then I'm able to, like, based on that, go out and actually conduct studies, or if needed, bring experts in to actually identify the affected resources and plan for ways that we're going to minimize impact to those resources. So I love having diversity in what I do. I also do a lot of environmental document writing and compliance too, so that we're actually making sure that we're following both our state laws, which is, the CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and then NEPA, at the federal level. So, so that's kind of a little bit, so there's a lot of diversity, honestly, in what I do. And yeah, I would say that really, like, my path has been somewhat circuitous, but I am really enjoying, I really enjoy learning. And so for me, that's kind of also a really important piece of my job, is just kind of learning new things every day. And as far as advice to someone who's new and is thinking they want to work in the environmental sector, I would say that it's very important to take opportunities as they come. Even if it's just an internship, internships can lead to great opportunities. Like, they can also allow you to explore maybe areas that you're interested in, but you're not totally sure, you kind of want to make like a switch from where you're currently working. Take those opportunities. Like, all experiences, may help you down the road in your career in ways that you really didn't even, weren't even expecting. And don't be afraid to make changes in your field. Like, if you find that you're wanting to try something new, I think that that's like some of the people that I work with, who I consider my mentors. They don't always have the same background as I do. They have a lot of different backgrounds and experiences that have all kind of added together to give them, expertise. And the other thing I was gonna say is that it's really important, I think, to kind of identify what your short-term goals and your long-term goals would be. So maybe, your short-term goal being like to try some sort of opportunity, pursue an internship in something that you might be interested in, but really long-term, you see yourself working, in, climate change policy or law. But yeah, have those experiences. Don't be afraid to change direction, and really try and identify like what is most important to you. If in my case, what's very important to me is to be able to spend some time outside as part of my job. And so, I've really kind of made that an important piece of what I'm doing now. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of my message. That's my message. And yeah, I guess we'll take questions at the end, but thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that, and we will now turn to Dr. Benjamin.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's morning in Portland, Oregon, where I am. Good afternoon, where you are. I would like to thank ELI for having me. It's great to be on a panel of women that are so amazing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's story. I think you'll probably hear a lot of overlaps. Like Dannique, my path is very circuitous and unexpected. And I think one of the things that Dannique said really resonates with me. It's not just that I learned about the law as I was going through my career, I learned about myself and what I really like and what I don't like. And so those choices, you really don't think about it that way, but those choices are really important to make yourself happy, basically. The laws and environmental law is a great area of law. It's very diverse, but you have to make sure that you're happy in what you're doing. And what I learned along the way was that I really like learning. And so the research part of my job now is really interesting to me and I really enjoy it. And I also really learned, particularly through COVID, that I like variation in my day. And so I like being in the classroom with students for part of my day. I like being at home researching for part of my day. I like giving talks. I like just sitting and writing quietly on my own. So I actually need a lot of that in my day, and not having that it makes me unhappy. So I think part of your career trajectory is learning about what makes you happy and trying to make sure that you are able to carve out a career that does that. And so just to start, so basically from the beginning, I'm from the Bahamas. I was born there. I grew up there, and it's an English common law jurisdiction. And so like most lawyers, I suspect I did an undergraduate in Canada in literature and history. I had no idea what I wanted to do with that. And so the default was, let's go to law school. And so because the Bahamas is a common law jurisdiction, I ended up going to law school in the United Kingdom in London. And that law school had no environmental law. It just wasn't offered when I was in law school. It was a very commercially focused law school. And so you're basically funneled into large commercial law firms. And so I ended up at a really big commercial law firm in London. And so my students, when they look at what I do now in climate change and advocating for small and developing states, they have no idea that I spent a significant chunk of my career as a commercial lawyer in a large law firm in the city of London, working for commercial clients. And I loved it. So I learned a lot of great skills that stood me in really good stead in the climate change negotiations where I ended up. I learned really good drafting skills. I learned great negotiation skills. I interacted with very, very smart people. I learned a huge amount, and that was my sort of grounding in the practice of law. And it was very beneficial for me. So I spent 12 years in London, 7 in private practice. And I paid off my debts. I made great friends. I was making money, so I enjoyed the city of London, which, pre-COVID was a great city to live in, very diverse. And so I just enjoyed my life. And then at a certain point in that career, you have to start thinking about partnership tracks, and people start talking to me about it. And I thought about it, and I thought, I'm spending a lot of time. The hours are brutal, and so it's like I'm spending a lot of time in an area that is interesting to me, but I don't really feel fulfilled doing it. And so that sort of these sort of turning points in your career, I think, are moments where you really have to sit and reflect. And I made personal choices. So my parents were getting older. I hadn't lived in the Bahamas for over 20 years. And so I decided my husband was very amenable to it. And so we moved to the Bahamas. And I ended up taking another job in private practice for 1 year there. And I hated it. It was straight corporate law. And when you're unhappy, you're unhappy as well. I think that's something you have to you just feel it. And you have to listen to that. So I spent a year doing straight corporate law, and I thought, this is not a good move. And so then I was kind of stuck, and it was very stressful. And I ended up, a friend of mine said, oh, look, there's a tutoring for law school on weekends. So you could tutor students in the Bahamas who were going to take the LLB degree in London. They were doing it by distance. And I wish I took a picture of the school, because it was basically in this random area above a gas station in this tiny little airlift room. And I loved it. I loved it. So I would spend my Saturdays tutoring students. And I never thought about a career in teaching or in academia. It had never occurred to me. And so there was an opening at the University of the Bahamas in the law school. I applied for it. And because I didn't have a master's degree, they required that I do one. So they were flexible in allowing me to start teaching and doing an LLM, which I did by distance at the same time. And when I was doing my LLM, I then took an international environmental law course. And that covered climate change. And I thought, oh, wow, I'm in a small and developing state. We are highly vulnerable, and this is hugely problematic. And so that really is what ignited my love of environmental law, and that's why I focused on climate change. And so I spent 10 years, almost 11 years at the University of the Bahamas in the law school teaching. It wasn't a huge career move in terms of financially or in terms of career advancement, But I wanted to be at home. I wanted to contribute to my country. I wanted to spend time with my family and friends that were there. And I did that. And during that period, which was not sort of a great move, I did not just an LM, but then I started a PhD. And because you're in a national tertiary educational institution, you do a lot of policy work with the government. And that's what I did. So I did a significant amount of voluntary time working on policy formation with the government. So I was involved with a lot of drafting of the Freedom of Information Act, a lot of drafting around women and gender and violence, which is not really my area, but I felt very passionate about. And of course, I worked in trade, and the government at the time for many years was thinking about joining the WTO, so I ended up being on the Trade Commission. And I also did a lot of work for the government in their environmental commission, so basically their Ministry of the Environment. And I became involved in the climate negotiations. And so because there's so few people, it was a great opportunity. So anyone that really deals in climate change is a really small world, particularly in the Bahamas, which is 350,000 people. And so I was very privileged to be allowed on the government delegation to negotiate, and basically I became the legal advisor for the government in climate change. I worked a lot on compliance, and I negotiated for the government, not as an observer, but in the room with other countries in AOSIS. I made great colleagues and friends in AOSIS. I have a huge amount of respect for those negotiators. I'm still friends with them today. They do guest lectures for my classes, which is great. And so I learned a huge amount through those negotiations. Those international negotiations are a massive classroom for someone who wants to learn about the law and policy of climate change. And through that work, I ended up being invited to, nominated basically by my government to be on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Compliance Committee for the Kyoto Protocol. And so I've been on the facilitated branch for that for 6 years. And so it's a less political element of the negotiations, but it is important. So you review country reports and make sure that if a country looks like it needs some facilitation or advice, you can provide that. And so that involves traveling. We used to involve traveling to Germany twice a year. Now we do it virtually, which time-wise is terrible for me in Portland. But again, I made great friends, great colleagues, and I learned a huge amount. And then after I finished my PhD, I ended up, funnily enough, doing my PhD in an area I didn't want to do it in. I wanted to do trade and climate change, but they didn't have supervisors for that, and I couldn't afford to do it in person, so I did it by distance. And I did it through a university in the UK that did part-time distance programs. And so the only combination I could really think of that they had supervisors for was a combination of corporate law and climate change. Mainly I had corporate law supervisors, and they were willing to kind of, manage my climate change chapters as well. And so it ended up, and so I just basically published a book this year, 2 months ago, by Cambridge University Press, which is my PhD, and it's on companies in climate change theory and law in the United Kingdom. And so it's a really a good combination of my experience of both working in the climate world and also my corporate and commercial background. I managed to, through my PhD, and I started this 6 years ago when people were not thinking about the obligations of companies and non-state actors in climate change. I kind of went out on a limb with this, and my supervisors went with me, and I'm very lucky that that has actually become a very hot topic. And so I published as I was doing my PhD, and my PhD was a way to sort of transition, because after 12 years in the Bahamas and 10 years in the University of Bahamas, I realized it was time for a change. And while I was there, not only was I doing a PhD, but I went to conferences. I presented my work at conferences all over the world. Luckily, I would get funding from the university. If I didn't, I would pay for it myself. And through those conferences, I met a lot of great people. And the people that I met have really been instrumental in the career changes that I made. And so after I finished my PhD, I applied for a postdoctoral fellowship, which I was accepted at Oxford. And that was a great opportunity just to sort of stop teaching and think and really write. And those faculty at Oxford really helped me and mentored me and helped me think about sort of different phases in my career. I had also met a number of US academics just through presenting at conferences, and I just liked them, and I got along with them, and I developed a network sort of unintentionally. I just liked the people that I liked that were in my field. And so one of them ended up inviting me to do a visiting assistant professor position at Penn State, which I did. And then through that, basically she became my mentor and said, why don't you go on the US job market? And I just had never thought about it. And so she mentored me through the process. I was very lucky to be offered a position at Lewis & Clark as an assistant professor, and so I've been there for 2 years, and I teach energy law, I teach international climate change law, which I'm really happy that I'm able to do. and administrative law and environmental justice. And so I've had major pivots in terms of countries, subject matters in my career. And I think my advice would be to be open, as Dannique said, to be open to those pivots, to know when you're unhappy and make a change and learn what you really like. And so for me, I love the mix of teaching and research and presenting at conferences, and I do a little bit of the negotiation still. I'm not fully in them anymore. And I also think I've learned what I really like, and that has helped me make decisions about where I want to be, the cities I want to live in, where I'm comfortable. All those things are really important. And so if you're lucky, you're able to make sure that your career fits your life and your life fits your career. And the other thing I would add is be open to networks. I cannot tell you how important people have been in my life that I just met at conferences and gone along with, and have mentored me and helped me. And I definitely, the advice I was given by a mentor was when I was thanking her, she said, pay it forward, and I do. So I mentor women of color going on the US job market through an existing network that I'm part of that has been, instrumental for me and also for other women. And so I think that's really important as well. Like when you are helped in your career, pay it forward, and that's important for me. So thank you all for being here, and it's great to meet everybody. I'm looking forward to everyone else's story.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and congratulations on the publication. We will now turn to our next speaker, Marissa.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, ELI, for having me. I'm really excited about this. I love these kind of panels. I guess what's different about me from the panelists so far is I work for industry. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about my company, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I do for my company. So I work for a company called Bloom Energy, and we manufacture solid oxide fuel cell energy servers that provide primary and backup power to all sorts of commercial and industrial facilities, think hospitals, universities, et cetera. We're really a technology company, right? So our platform is fuel agnostic. Right now, our revenue offering operates on natural gas, which has significant criteria pollutant benefits vis-a-vis other combustion offerings. We've piloted hydrogen. We're working on an electrolyzer. We're working on a solution in the marine context that would have huge implications for GHG emissions in that space. So, we're a company that's working on technology that I think is really, really critical to sort of the energy transition, not only in this country, but in the world. So what do I do there? I am essentially the environmental and safety lead for the company. Technically, my position is not a legal position. My position does not have to be done by a lawyer. But I think that a lot of the issues in this space are driven by the law. And I think that if I went away tomorrow, my company would probably choose to have a lawyer in this space, even though they didn't know they wanted that at the beginning. So I say all that to say, like, I think, as someone who's interested in in a career in environmental law and policy, there's a lot of different ways it can go. And I think you heard that from the first two panelists as well. So one of the reasons why I took this non-legal position is because this company is really a teenage company. It's been public for about 3 years. It's been around for less than 20. And I could tell based on my research of the company and through the interview process that this was going to be an opportunity for me to build the kind of programs and systems and processes that I had worked on my entire career from the ground up. And I just saw that as an amazing opportunity to, grow and flex and use the skills that I had gained over the last 15 years. And, if nothing else, it would be an opportunity that allowed me to gather skills that would allow me to pivot to the next thing in my career, or maybe it's, my forever thing that has yet to be seen. But I say that to say that I think you should always be thinking about what does your next move mean in the context of your larger goals. So at the end of the day, again, this was just something that I think was a means to bring together all of the things that I'd done over the course of my career at a company that I think is really doing something that has the potential to impact the world. So how did I get here? Well, what inspired me to be in the environmental legal space? I can say that I'm someone who said I wanted to be a lawyer from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, But not unlike Lisa, I went to college and I was a poli-sci major. I thought I wanted to be a criminal lawyer because that's what I had seen on TV and that's what the lawyers in my life did. And I went to my first day of criminal law and we were reading a case about a young girl that was basically tortured and raped by her stepdad. And the stepdad got off on a technicality. And right there on that first day, I knew that as a young woman with a small daughter, I was not going to be a criminal lawyer. And so the rest of law school became about, how do I figure out what the thing is if that's not the thing, right? And unlike Lisa, I did have the opportunity to take environmental and land use courses. I really excelled in them, but there was nothing about those fields that told me that I could have a career in them, right? Like, it's not the stuff that's on TV. It's not the stuff that you see every day. And unless I think you happen to know somebody who's practiced in this area or worked for an NGO or something, you don't necessarily know that this is an option for you in terms of a career. So the other thing that I will say, just in contrast to Dannique, is I also thought I was math and science averse in the school setting. It turns out I'm not in the practical, but I say that to say that you don't have to have a math and science background to excel in this field. In fact, I think not having one can be an advantage in some spaces, because a lot of what your job is as an environmental lawyer is bridging the gap between technical experts and the public or a decision-making body that doesn't really have the technical skills that someone who's in the weeds on these issues does. And that's not to say that, you know, having a science and math background doesn't also give you a superpower, but I just don't want people to be discouraged if they haven't spent their entire education focused on these things. In terms of like how I got my start, I'd say some luck and coincidence. Like I said, I had a small child when I was in law school. I needed a job. I happened to get a great job at a mid-sized law firm and was placed in their land use and environmental group. And I started my career doing a lot of really traditional land use work. So a ton of environmental review and permitting work, California Environmental Quality Act, National Environmental Policy Act, worked for a variety of clients from Walmart to energy clients to mining clients. And I think via sort of the process of environmental review and working on litigation associated with environmental review, you get introduced to a lot of basic air, water, et cetera concepts. Because we were a group that did land use, real estate, and environmental work, I started reviewing phase ones and got to learn a little bit about environmental due diligence. And after about 2 years at this law firm, which was, again, mid-sized, which meant you had the opportunity to sort of go as far and as fast as your performance dictated, which I think is a little bit different than if you started a big firm and there's sort of like that traditional junior work. I was able to move to a similarly sized firm in Los Angeles that did a lot of that large scale industrial infrastructure permitting work, but also had a very niche air compliance practice. And the lawyers that hired me there thought, because of the work I had done in the permitting world and on environmental review, that they could very easily teach me sort of this air compliance practice. And so I learned that practice, did a lot of work in the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is the most heavily regulated air basin in the country. And then 2008 hit. And the firm that had been mid-sized when I got there had merged with a big firm, Alston and Bird. And it became very, very clear that you needed to do anything and everything that anyone asked in order to keep yourself busy and keep your job during the recession, right? And so at that time, I took the opportunity to just bring on all sorts of new stuff in the environmental world. I learned water, I learned traditional environmental litigation, CERCLA, state analogs. I just did whatever anyone asked of me. And again, making those decisions, saying yes to the Prop 65 work, saying yes to, you know, green chemistry work as that regulation was evolving in California, saying yes to climate change work just dictated that, you know, I expanded the breadth of what I knew. And in and around 2013, an in-house position for BNSF Railway in Los Angeles became available. And I had worked for BNSF early in my career at that first law firm. I knew they had great issues in the permitting space, the airspace, mobile source air issues, which are rare. You don't get the opportunity to work on mobile source air issues a lot. And I would tell you that there were a lot more senior people than me that applied for that position. There aren't a lot of environmental in-house jobs that come up in the LA area. But because I had been open to all of those opportunities I just talked about, and I had sort of expanded the breadth of what I knew, I actually probably had the most diverse experience in the candidate pool. And so I was ultimately able to get that job. So I came into BNSF as a lawyer, but BNSF had recently made the decision that the environmental lawyers were not going to sit in the law department, but rather we're going to sit in the environmental department. So I reported to a vice president that was a non-lawyer, which means I had like almost immediate exposure to the C-suite because there was no lawyer between, there's really no lawyer between me and my general counsel where environmental issues were concerned. So that kind of foreshadows what I was talking about, how I got into a sort of non-legal role at this juncture. So I worked there at BNSF for 3 years. Again, great issues, great work. Again, took the opportunity to say yes to things that maybe lawyers wouldn't always say yes to. There was a legal decision that dictated we needed to do a system-wide stormwater project. The compliance team was really, really oversubscribed. We were in the process of developing an ISO 14001 management system, and there was just a lot going on. And I raised my hand and said, hey, I'll be the project manager. I'll manage the budget. I'll manage the spreadsheets. Let me add some skills to, you know, what I already do. There was the opportunity to get really deeply involved in some air policy work in California and work with a coalition of folks and have the opportunity to provide leadership for the company, but also for the railroad industry in that context. And that was, you know, one of many times where I had the opportunity to really work at the intersection of law and policy, which I love doing. What else? I was just able to do a lot of new and different things that I wouldn't have been able to do at a law firm. I traveled around the country, learning the railroad and learning all sorts of new and issues, different skills and issues. Speaking specifically to that ISO 14001 management system that I described, I volunteered to be the lawyer that was supporting the compliance team as they were putting that together. And I learned about what ISO policies and systems and procedures look like. I learned how to develop a corporate environmental policy. I learned how to get buy-in at the upper management levels for those types of things. So I was just, you know, able to do all sorts of things those first few years. And after a few years, I was promoted to be not only the lead of our environmental legal team, but because I had done all of those non-legal things, my vice president decided, I think it makes sense for you to lead air and climate programs from a corporate standpoint, a corporate technical standpoint as well. So me and another technical employee managed compliance, grant programs, sustainability policy for BNSF as a company. And I was able to dig deeper into some of sort of those technical issues and really learn about managing environmental compliance from a technical standpoint as opposed to a legal standpoint. And all of that really led me to where I am today. I had a kid that was getting ready to graduate from college, and it was the first time in a long time that I had the opportunity to spread my wings and move somewhere different. And this opportunity with Bloom became available. And I really saw it as a way for me to bring together all of the things I had done, like I said earlier, and really build something from the ground up that was mine. So I think what I just told you kind of illustrates how diverse my practice has been over the course of the last 15 years. I think there are a couple of things to be said about that. I think the first is that the practice of environmental law generally is one of the most diverse practice areas around. I don't think there are a lot of other practice areas where you have the opportunity to work on administrative law, transactions, litigation, both in the traditional litigation context, but also in the record context. I can't think of another practice area where, you know, you literally do a little bit of everything. When I think back to the beginning of my career, when I was working in that group that did real estate and environmental and land use, I also worked a lot on real estate contracts. And I often look back and think and go, wow, what if all I did was look at the same form, you know, every day, all day for my entire career? I know for me, that wouldn't have worked for me. And that's why I gravitated to this path versus that one. The other thing I would say is I think that my path demonstrates that I kind of said yes to anything and everything, even things that didn't necessarily make sense. And so my advice to all of you is to do the same thing. I think, of course, if you want to be something specific, if you want to work in a specific sector, if you want to work at a specific ENGO or at a specific agency, or you want to be a professor, you obviously want to make decisions and do things that put yourself in a position to do that. But don't be so wedded to doing that specific thing on day one, and try to think about how, you know, any number of things that you might do at steps 1, 2, and 3 might ultimately lead to you being exactly where you want to be at that end. I would also really echo Lisa's sentiments about being a joiner and networking. I've taken every opportunity to be involved in, you know, every environmental organization that I can be, to take leadership roles there, to volunteer. I've been so blessed to meet so many people that have, you know, done so many things for me in my career. And I would just say, you know, I have seen so many young lawyers or law students join up and raise their hand and open themselves up to relationships that got them, you know, to point C way before they ever would have had they not done that. So really, really, really encourage you guys to network and to take any opportunity that you think has the potential to, you know, help you get to where your goals tell you you want to be. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that advice and sharing your career trajectory. We will now move to Loyalty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Loyalty Chang, and I'm the co-head of the Environmental Transactional Group at Davis Polk. I just want to thank ELI for inviting me to speak today. And I also just wanted to add that I'm really honored to be speaking with such a great group of panelists today. So how did I get where I am today? Well, I never intended to be an environmental lawyer. Heck, I didn't even know what environmental law was. There were no environmental law classes at law school when I went to law school, which was back in the dinosaur age. And I don't have a science background. I came to Davis Polk in '86, knowing that I was going to be a corporate transactional lawyer. I did M&A work, I did capital markets work, I did finance. At the time, the firm had a rotation system where you would rotate for 18 months through all the main corporate groups, and then you would do mini rotations. And at the end of 5 years, you would basically pick the group that you wanted to specialize in. Well, during the week that I was supposed to pick that group, in other words, go above the line, the managing partner walks into my office and says to me, "Hey, Loyalty, do you want to help, start the environmental transactional group at Davis Polk?" I was filled with trepidation. I thought for sure that I was going to be fired, but instead he'd asked me to try to start this group. I felt long and hard about it. I didn't know whether it was going to be a career killer, given the seniority in my career path at that point in time. Heck, if I was going to take on something that I didn't know anything about and I failed, would I be basically fired at that point? It was really scary to me. I hummed and hawed for a while, And I just decided just to go with the flow and said yes. I decided that, given the fact that I'd done 5 years of transactional work, I was starting to get bored doing the same types of deals over and over. So I spent the first several months learning everything I possibly could. I went to seminars, I participated in conferences, I read literally everything I can get my hands on. And slowly but surely, I grew the practice to what it is today. I'm pretty proud to say that today our practice consists of basically 7 full-time lawyers doing nothing but environmental transactional work. And just I presented some slides, and this slide sort of just tells you a little bit about what I do. So in addition to doing the environmental facet of all the corporate transactions, and that would include M&A, capital markets, credit, bankruptcy, real estate, and the like, I also do standalone environmental work. I work on a variety of deals, and it's very, very fast paced. At any given point in time, I have probably about 40 to 50 outstanding matters, and in any given day, I basically bill between 10 to 15 matters. I work on a lot of cross-border transactions. As some of you may know, Davis Polk has offices in Europe and in Asia, and I work a lot with them as well. And we're generally involved in all stages of the deals, everything from collecting the data to spotting the issues, to counseling clients, and to negotiating and drafting the underlying contracts. We have the same skill sets and responsibilities as general corporate lawyers with respect to deal management, diligence, and drafting. And what's really critical to our practice is basically staying on top of regulatory developments. This has been particularly challenging in recent times. As you can imagine, going from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration, it's like having whiplash. So with the Trump administration sort of being focused on rolling back environmental laws, and with the Biden administration trying to restore back the environmental laws and focusing on climate change, it's been both exciting and really challenging trying to advise our clients on how these regulatory developments have obviously, will impact their activities, their operations, and their businesses. This next slide is just sort of a slide on the representative matters that I've been worked on. As you can tell, I work on a wide range of matters and across all different sectors and involving all different types of issues. I won't go into details as to what all these matters are, but I would point out that some of the more recent deals that I've worked on, which have been really interesting, are things relating to ESG linked loans and green bond offerings. So these are really new instruments which have never been done before. And ESG linked loans are basically loans that are linked to ESG metrics, so that if the borrower meets these ESG metrics, the interest rate on the underlying loans will go down. And if they fail to meet these metrics, the underlying interest rate will obviously go up. These metrics could be anything relating to, for example, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by a certain time frame. I've also been doing a lot of green bond offerings, which I love. Again, these are new instruments where the proceeds of the green bond offerings are used to fund green projects. As everyone knows, there's probably no particular definition of what constitutes a green project, but it could be anything. It's described in the prospectus. It could be anything relating to, for example, manufacturing of sustainability products, or just the implementation of a wastewater treatment facility. These are all new instruments. They're cutting edge, and we're doing it all in real time. There's no precedents out there, and so it's been very exciting just to work on these particular matters. The next couple of slides I thought would be helpful if I just described a particular matter that has come across my desk and may be representative of a matter that I do in the M&A space. So what happens? A lawyer walks into your office and says, we have a private equity client. He wants to buy a single facility target, and in this case, it's a cement manufacturing facility. He also tells you it's on an expedited time frame. Let me just tell you, everything is on an expedited time frame. There's no sense in thinking it's not, and I've never done a deal where someone has walked in and said, hey, Loyalty, I've got a deal for you. It's a relaxed time schedule. You've got 3 months. Don't worry about it. That just doesn't happen. So, I'm sorry. Okay, so what happens? So he tells you that the seller's marketing pitch for doing this deal is as follows. The facility is extremely profitable. Its business generates a ton of money. Sorry, the computer is really slow. The site has had a long operating history, but the facility itself is pretty brand new. It's got the capacity to increase production should a buyer wishes to do so. And it uses as a fuel source an alternative waste, and in this particular case, it's a biofuel, it's ethanol. So what do we do next? We have to conduct due diligence. We obviously have to identify what the risks are with respect to this transaction and advise the client accordingly as to whether this is a good deal to be entered into. So after conducting our due diligence, what do we identify? Well, unfortunately, this facility emits significant outputs of carbon dioxide, which everyone knows is a greenhouse gas. Because of its long operating history, unfortunately, there's a ton of contamination at this particular site. Even though we can increase capacity and we have the ability to do so, unfortunately, that would reopen some key permit terms in some of our environmental permits. And the mercury emissions, unfortunately, are also near permitted levels. And finally, because this facility stores and disposes of hazardous waste on site, it's been deemed to be or designated to be in a hazardous waste disposal facility, which unfortunately means it's heavily regulated. So now what do we do next? Well, obviously, we take the results of our due diligence and we have to weigh the pros and cons. Oops, sorry about that. And in connection with weighing the pros and cons, we have to figure out, so do any of these issues pose any risk? And if so, what is the risk to the buyer? How much will it cost? What are the liabilities? So for example, in this particular case, as we know, we've identified significant amounts of contamination at the site. How much will it cost to clean up that site? How long will it take? If we need to install additional control equipment because our mercury levels are near permitted levels, how much will that cost and how long will that take? How similarly situated are our competitors? So these are all issues we have to identify. We, of course, work with environmental consultants because we as lawyers can't really estimate what these costs are, but consultants can. And once we've determined sort of a range of what these liabilities might be, we have to figure out, so how do we allocate the risk in the underlying purchase agreement? Who bears those costs? Is the buyer? Does the seller? Who has responsibility for the remediation? Do we buy pollution liability insurance in the event that there is contamination that we haven't identified? Do we buy reps and warranty insurance in the event that the seller breaches his environmental reps and his representations and warranties so that we have some recourse at least? So, you know, we just determine what all these issues are and then we advise the client accordingly. So this is just sort of a quick, basically case study of what an M&A deal is that might have come across my desk. In a nutshell, this is really what my practice consists of. What are some key takeaways after doing this for over 3 decades? Unfortunately, I'm probably one of the more boring people because unlike the rest of the panelists who've had all, you know, these great careers in different areas and professions, I've actually been at the firm, you know, since I graduated law school in '86, and I haven't done anything else, but I've at least become really good at what I'm doing, having done it for so long. The key takeaway is pretty similar to what everyone else has said. Basically, if an opportunity comes your way, even though it might appear to be really daunting or challenging at first, just go for it. I mean, I promise you, you probably won't regret that. So thank you all for joining. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the program, and I look forward to speaking with you guys.
Thank you so much, Linty. We will now move to our next speaker here, which is Erin Eastwood.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Caitlin and ELI, for inviting me. It's such an honor to be on this panel with really incredibly accomplished fellow panelists. I'm a little earlier in my career, so it's just been really cool sitting here and like learning from what you all have to say. And I think I have some to contribute that is, you know, really in line. And there are a lot of overlaps, I think, between all of our career paths and just like the general takeaways. So I am the program director at the National Ocean Protection Coalition, which is a coalition of more than 50 organizations committed to protecting our ocean's special places. We work on what are called marine protected areas. So it's basically an area set aside for the preservation of nature. But I am actually a scientist by trade. I'm very similar to Dannique, sort of coming at this from the academic from an academic background, and never ever would have imagined myself being in not only the NGO space, but in the like advocacy space, and really intersecting with how can science and this scientific information that we have decades of, you know, building up, how can we take that and help make sure that we have proper environmental laws and policies in place. So yeah, just never would have imagined myself being here. But I'll do a little bit of the arc of my career and just highlight certain like lessons, I guess, learned, or what I can share. So as I mentioned, you know, my background is in academic science. I was also motivated by being outside all the time as much as I possibly could. And I really fell in love with the ocean and coral reefs and kelp forests in particular growing up. My home is here in California, and I just had some fantastic opportunities as an undergrad to go visit a few coral reefs and contribute to like on the ground conservation projects and research, and just really fell in love. So I went off and got my master's thinking I want to be a field biologist for the rest of my life, and this is going to be just so amazing, documenting like the drivers of the biological diversity on our planet. But quickly realized my work as a scientist was mostly documenting the demise kind of our planet, and really uncovering the pathways and all the different ways that diversity is threatened. So that got me motivated to use science for solutions, or really just start thinking about how can science help to inform smart, innovative solutions to what we knew was going on. So at my master's, I embarked on a master's degree in New York City and had the opportunity to be studying marine protected areas in the South Pacific, and using sort of scientific information, genetic information to figure out where should we put these marine protected areas and marine reserves if you're only going to be able to put like a small amount aside. You know, there's trade-offs involved with like putting areas aside from fishing and other uses of the ocean. So if you only have a small amount, where should you put them to maximize the benefit of these protected areas for the rest of the ecosystem, and ultimately for human communities? So that was a really awesome, really cool project. I really loved it, loved the combo of lab work and field work, and loved that my science was theoretically informing, hopefully, a solution, you know, like really handing this information off to the decision makers in this small island nation that I was working in, and helping to inform their thoughts and thinking around putting in a new network of these MPAs. But quickly realized, again, I had no idea how science gets in the hands of decision makers, what decision makers even need to know. Like, it was almost just like I quickly realized they're completely different languages almost, or at least the way that I had been approaching it at the time. So that piqued my interest in just like the science policy space, and, you know, how do scientists and how do researchers smartly try to engage and inform decision making. So this is all during my master's, and I just, again, randomly took this opportunity, a volunteering opportunity, to help a friend of mine like dissect some urchins and whatever. And there was this really cool person there who I connected with, and we were chatting about these thoughts that I was having. And she said, you know, I did this fellowship a few years ago that was just really incredible and took me to where I am now, which is working in the science and policy space. It's called the Knaus Fellowship. You should look into it. And I looked into it, and it was like exactly what I was looking for and needed. So, I mean, I'll just pause and be like, yeah, 100% yes to the saying yes to opportunities, volunteering, connecting with people you think are cool, and you're like, hey, how'd you get where you are? So without her sort of pointing this out, I might have found out about that fellowship, but I doubt I would have found out about it at such a perfect time where it just really resonated. So I applied and I got it, which was really just such a relief and amazing. And I packed up and moved to DC to do a year where the purpose of this particular fellowship was they take marine science researchers and put you in a year-long placement in a federal agency or on the Hill in a congressional office to kind of help scientists understand, number one, how to inform policy, but also to provide that scientific technical expertise to these decision makers who need it. So it was fantastic. I worked at NOAA in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in their climate program office, and got to work. This was the last year of the Obama administration. And so, climate change, like everyone was working fervently towards trying to advance some of these really cool ideas. And I got to explore coastal blue carbon and just the idea that there are certain coastal habitats that take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil for thousands of years. And the question was like, how do we sort of leverage that in the fight against climate change? So it was just a very cool experience. It was only 1 year, so super short, but in that time, I got to really understand a little bit more about how the federal government works, how the executive branch works, how sort of these huge decisions get made, and all of the different people working to advance different parts of them. So it was just like a really fantastic grounding, I think. As a scientist, you think of policy, it's this huge nebulous thing, and so this fellowship helped me kind of define it a little bit more and start to understand the levers of how you can really actually work within the system. So that was amazing. My fellowship was up, and sort of by luck and chance, a position opened up at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and I was already thinking of moving back to California, which is my home, and just was kind of trying to get back to the West Coast. And it was this really cool opportunity in the NGO space, which I had, again, not had much experience with. Applied, got the job, moved out here, and just quickly began to learn about how awesome and creative and cool advocacy work can be. Taking and working at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and aquariums in general, they occupy a really unique space, I think, in the NGO world, where they're at the intersection of public education and really having a reach and access to the average human being, like just people who love the ocean and are interested. Also having in-house research teams and scientific expertise. That aquarium in particular is really a science-based institution. And then having like this reach in their community, they're leaders in their community, they are embedded in regions that really care about the ocean. So sort of combining those three things and thinking about what are some cool ways that we can get the public involved and engaged in policy making, which I think most people come to the aquarium wanting to look at some otters and the kelp forest, and it's really cool. And like, I absolutely loved that part too. But sort of how can we help people understand, like, we have a lot of work to do right now to try to improve things for our ocean. So that was a fantastic opportunity. I was there for 3 years. It was a really great introduction to NGOs and kind of how NGOs can work and really make an impact in the space. And this is kind of similar to what some folks had mentioned about just sometimes personal life, like changes happen. So my partner was looking to go to grad school. And so I kind of knew like we were maybe going to be moving to a different city. So I was just trying to like think of other opportunities and maybe sensing like there's some changes in the air and I should start looking around for what's next for me. And then COVID hit. So that just kind of, took care of itself. The aquariums around the country, as so many businesses really suffered, had to close their doors, lost all their revenue. Our aquarium had to furlough, I think it was 45% of staff. So I was part of that furlough, and that was a really, just like humbling experience and something I never thought I would ever have to deal with in my life. Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of good personal growth for sure. And definitely kind of weirdly a silver lining, because so many folks just kind of rallied, you know, and like came. This was, I think, an unprecedented time for all of us, no matter what you were experiencing. So it was, you know, a great opportunity for me to kind of breathe, take a break too. I took a month off and was just like, okay, I'm just gonna like garden, which was really lovely. And I turned to my networks. So this was, and I'll just like put another emphasis on some of the things that others have been saying is throughout your career, like really, I think invest in those relationships that give you value, that you really, you know, have mutual respect. There's like, you have fun with these people, you just enjoy working with them, because you just never know when like you need your tribe to kind of like rally around you. So, you know, many of these folks that I had formed relationships with through my work at the aquarium, but also previous work, who were in other NGOs and other like other places that perhaps weren't suffering as badly from COVID, they were able to kind of bring me on to a few independent projects. So I pivoted to like consulting, which I never thought I would ever be a consultant either. So it was just a super interesting and cool learning experience as well. I did that for about 3 or 4 months and just was, you know, I could talk about that forever, just a whole separate topic of like consulting in that world. But I know I'm kind of running out of time. So just ultimately what ended up happening was one of my consulting clients who I just was really loving and the work was really cool. She ended up having an opportunity to bring me on full time. And so just, you know, asked if I wanted to apply. And so I did. And here I am now in my new full-time position with the NOPC. And the work that we do at this organization is specifically focused on marine protected areas. So I find it was a weird full circle moment, lots of really cool learning experiences through my career up until this point, and it's totally not over. I like have no idea what I'm going to do next, and there's no need to know what I'm going to do next. I think I'm in a place of really enjoying what I'm doing and just continuing to learn and grow. So yeah, I mean, the lessons that I kind of highlighted throughout the whole thing was just, you know, number one, don't be afraid to follow your curiosity and do something completely different that you never would have expected. For me, that was policy. And number two, you know, look into fellowships. There are great opportunities, training opportunities. ELI, I know, has a lot of really fantastic training opportunities that I personally benefited from. I took the boot camp when I was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and had no background in legislative, like just the laws, like literally what are the laws. So I took it and thank God, you know, it was a godsend. Thank you, Caitlin. And third, yeah, just networks are just so incredibly important, and not in like a superficial way, like really try to work on authentic connections and authentic professional, just like friendships, I guess, that you make, because it just makes life so much better generally, not to mention in times of crisis, like for me. So yeah, I think I'll pause there and excited for the questions. And thank you again, Caitlin and ELI, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Erin. We appreciate you sharing with us, and definitely a common theme we're seeing throughout is just the importance of saying yes and each other, and we really appreciate that message. We will now turn to Ruth. Oh, Ruth, I think you are muted. You're unmuted.
Okay, great, thank you. The most important phrase in the COVID period is you are muted. Thank you to ELI for continuing this venerable tradition of the summer school, which is a wonderful kind of thing to do for people. And thank you to my fellow panelists. I kind of look at this conversation as a big Venn diagram where there's some overlap and then there's these areas of exploration and difference. So the first thing I would say is, and this is aimed at those of you who are undergraduates or in law school, you're probably part of this group because you have a passion and want to work on environmental issues. And I totally get that. But it's really important to remember, and we've kind of got a hint of that today, we live in a complex, interconnected world. So give yourself the permission to roam around a bit to get a variety of perspectives. If you're an undergraduate, remember that what Wallace Stegner or James Baldwin or Emily Dickinson wrote can help inform your understanding along with science, policy, and economics. And these perspectives can humanize your learnings. So remember that people from different backgrounds have different experiences, and the importance of that in forming policy. This is particularly important as we finally begin to confront environmental injustice. So understanding history, sociology, geography, psychology is part of that. If you're in law school, there are many pathways to the result you are seeking if your objective is cleaner air or making a dent in climate change. What the SEC does or how tax policy is formed and carried out can be as relevant to our environmental future as EPA. The second thing I would say is please accept and maybe even embrace the possibility of serendipity in your career, even of obstacles. You learn unexpected things along the way. And I want to illustrate this with an anecdote about two women who were highly influential in my life and career, Pat Wald and Jody Bernstein, who were two of 11 women who graduated Yale Law School in 1951. Pat was one of two women as an editor on the Yale Law Journal in her class, and she clerked for Jerome Falk on the Second Circuit, and Jody was also at the top of her class and on the Yale Board of Editors, and obviously both incredibly capable women. Pat was briefly at what is now Arnold and Porter, and then she left that to raise her 5 children, and Jody did the same. They became close, lifelong friends starting at Yale. And both told the story I heard numerous times of them sitting in one of their cars in a grocery parking lot, crying about their lost careers, trying to figure out the pathway forward. After about 6 years out, Pat made her way back into the working world, doing a variety of jobs, including legal services. You should Wikipedia Pat because it's very instructive. She eventually became Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs during much of the Carter administration, and then she was appointed to the DC Circuit and eventually worked as the US Rep to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Jody had a similar trajectory, and she became Carter's General Counsel at EPA. She hired me, and General Counsel at HEW before it was HHS. And part of the point here is that talent won out. I'm not recommending this pathway. Thankfully, women today have fewer barriers to entry, but I think part of what made Pat Wald such an outstanding judge was her humanity. The humanity was shaped by being from a poor family and from having a wide variety of life experiences and some disappointments. It was shaped by confronting uncertainty and a big element of unfairness. So I would say consider the possibility that life learning is as important as book learning. Both should be there in your toolkit and you will be the better for it. Very briefly, I want to tell you my own trajectory because it illustrates a word that's been used today before, a circuitous path. I went to law school at Berkeley because I wanted to practice poverty law with California rural legal assistance, but I met my husband and we moved east instead. Unexpectedly then, my first 2 positions were in legal aid offices in New Haven and Boston, 2 cities I never contemplated living or working in. We moved to Washington where I practiced public interest law. One of these was a very big case, which was then taken on to one of the major DC law firms because it needed that level of support. So I went there for a while. And in the middle of this litigation, I had my first baby. When my husband decided to teach, the most interesting possibility proximate to Duke Law School was with the state attorney general doing utility regulation. Again, something I never contemplated when I was certainly not in law school. This allowed me to learn a lot about how utility commissions worked, how rates were set. I had to hire and manage economic consultants, and this experience served me well much later when I started thinking about how to address climate change, because that's a really critically important part of that puzzle. Back in DC and also in Durham before I left there, I joined law firms. When we returned to DC, I joined not the environment part of DOJ, I joined the antitrust division at the Department of Justice. This was in part because while at the North Carolina AG office, I essentially tried an antitrust case in the context of a rate hearing. And if anybody's interested in that, I can explain it in greater detail offline. I worked in various other parts of the federal government, including on strange things like airline deregulation. Eventually, I found my way to EPA as an assistant general counsel. Jody Bernstein took a chance on me on the basis of my administrative law and litigation background. I never took, like a number of women in this panel, I never took an environmental law class, and I knew nothing about environmental law. That learning was definitely on the job, and I continue to this day to thank Jody for taking that chance. Threaded through this, I worked part-time at various points when my children were young. Some employers were slightly more forgiving than in Pat and Jody's era, and some were not. And therefore, some opportunities were not open to me because I was reluctant at various points to go full bore professionally. This could be a challenge in the private sector, and sometimes it was in government as well. I admit this was emotionally challenging. I saw people who I knew I was as competent and good as holding very high positions. When my husband's work took us to Poland, as part of that country's transition out of the former Soviet bloc, my career veered off in an entirely new direction, but one that built on everything I had done leading up to that. Living in a country that was trying to revive rule of law traditions after the devastation of first the Nazis and then the communists, I became really entranced in the issue, why do people obey environmental laws? And in my head, environmental laws were a proxy for why do people obey laws in general. We take so much for granted in the US about our culture of compliance, or we did until recently. I feel this issue is becoming increasingly more pertinent unexpectedly here in the US. When we returned to the US, rather than return to my EPA position as the Assistant General Counsel for Water, I was basically allowed to make up a position at EPA focusing on assisting environmental law development and implementation across the former Soviet bloc. This led me briefly to the State Department and then into the Washington, D.C. think tank world where I now reside. And it led me to climate change because international commitments must become domestic commitments if they are to mean anything at all. A lot of countries have great difficulty making good on those commitments because their legal systems are formal but not functional. Just as I had seen firsthand in Poland and as I had explored at this project I did at the State Department. And that's what I've been working on basically ever since. So for me, the bottom line is be open to possibilities that you never considered when you first sat down to plot out your career. I never anticipated going to live in Poland. It was a total surprise. Sometimes obstacles and challenges can also be opportunities. For me, moving geographically within the US and internationally provided possibilities I had never considered, despite the admitted anxieties of making those moves. We live in an imperfect world. Getting used to this and making the most of it is the card we've been dealt. I learned over time that how mission driven I am and how a lot of things that, as I say, that are unexpected end up fitting together and informing how you move forward. And I'm happy to talk about this. If I don't get the chance to say this later, I can be found at the Wilson Center website, and I'm always happy to talk to people who want to kind of speak more specifically about how to develop a career. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thanks for sharing that with us. And I believe it's time to turn over to, if the slide will change, to our final speaker, Dr. Roadblock.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be on this panel. I'm really honored to have been invited. I am a managing engineer at Exponent, and being an engineer, I couldn't help it. I have a few slides, so hopefully this will work. There we go, excellent. So I am an environmental engineer. I work at a consulting firm called Exponent, well, the firm is everywhere, but I'm based in Oakland, California. And my first question when I got invited to speak on this panel was, why on earth would you want to have an environmental consultant or an environmental engineer speak to a bunch of potential attorneys or already attorneys? And it pretty clearly became evident to me why it would be at least relevant to have me on this panel, is because I do actually work at the intersection of science and legal and regulatory issues. And so my perspective could be valuable for some of you. So more specifically, I work with attorneys, and you may have heard from the prior panelists that a lot of them have mentioned consultants, and so that's often someone like me. So I work with attorneys, insurance adjusters, or industrial clients, and oftentimes that we work on complicated technical issues, but that often tends to be in an adverse type of situation where there's a opposing party or opposing parties on the other side, and so there's a dispute that's ongoing. Sometimes it's just an opposing regulator that's putting our client in a difficult spot, and so I'm definitely working kind of at the intersection between science and law, and so my perspective might be interesting. So more specifically, what do I do and how do I work within this intersection of law and policy? And just a little bit of a caveat that the company that I work with, the consulting firm that I work with, is a little bit niche. Most consulting firms don't quite work so much in the litigation realm. And so that's what's a little bit unique about Exponent, and one of the reasons that I think it's particularly interesting. And so a lot of the work that I do is litigation support and expert witness work. And so that's working with attorneys, usually in a CERCLA type litigation, or sometimes RCRA, sometimes some other legal spaces, but it's usually CERCLA. And more specifically, what I do is usually environmental forensics. And so I try to reconstruct historical chemical releases. I try to understand who released the chemicals, because sometimes you have different owners. And so, was it the first owner, the second, the third, the neighbor? Usually it's how much was released, if we could sort of quantify that in some way. Also, when did the release occur? Because oftentimes insurance policies you'll have different insurance policies. So was the release during one insurance policy or the second insurance policy? Because insurance companies usually don't like to pay. So they try to make sure the other insurance policy will cover it. Oftentimes it's trying to understand how the release occurred. Was it, some of you may be familiar with this term, sudden and accidental release, or was it a long-term purposeful release? Oftentimes there are multiple parties that are involved, and so we have to allocate between multiple parties. And so but what's really interesting about this litigation work is that it's always different. The questions are different, the chemicals are different. So I've really had, I knew about some chemicals, but I've really had to spread my wings and learn about other chemicals and I'm constantly learning about new chemicals. Some of you may have heard of PFAS, and that's brand new to almost all of us. And so it's constantly changing and constantly different. For example, I work on a lot of dry cleaners, but the context in which I'm working on those dry cleaners is always different. In some cases, I work on regulatory and policy issues, but there again, I'm working kind of on the science side. And so assessing what is the science behind these regulations? Is there a good scientific basis for these regulations? Because sometimes there's an opportunity to sort of present the science in a different way for these regulations to say, well, you know, the science says this, and that might impact this regulation in this other way. Sometimes when our clients they're forced with meeting a new regulation and they have new guidelines, how are they going to meet those? What are the techniques they can use? Are there ways that maybe they can push back at some of those numerical guidelines because they might be more difficult to meet? And one thing that kind of surprised me with my job is that I often have to put on a historian's hat and go back in time to understand the historical regulations. And this actually surprised me. It's one of the most interesting parts of my job that I think is really, really fascinating, is to understand what was the historical context at the time, what were the regulations, what made sense, what were the standards of the practice at that time. And it usually involves a lot of historical research. Sometimes we work with historians to get that done. But it's something that totally surprised me. I didn't expect that at all as part of my job, and I thought it might be really boring, and it's actually super fascinating, which was quite a surprise. And so why do I find environmental consulting interesting? I really find it fascinating to work at the intersection between science and law. So I'm an engineer by training. I really had no interest in the law. And it was kind of serendipity that I ended up in this position. And I've had to learn so much about the law, and not by any means what you attorneys really understand. I just scratched the surface, but I've had to learn how to converse with attorneys and get some basic understanding of the different environmental laws that we work under, and also just the legal framework in which you folks work. What's a motion? What do these hearings mean? You know, so kind of the lingo. I've had to learn the lingo so that I can even converse with some of our clients. But I find that really fascinating because I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly learning scientifically, but I'm also learning from a regulatory perspective, a policy perspective, a legal perspective. It's just really, really fascinating. Another thing that I really particularly enjoy is explaining science to people, particularly lay people. I love teaching. I didn't go into teaching in academia for personal reasons. It's a really challenging area to get into, particularly as an engineer, and I didn't want to move to Nowheresville, so I preferred to stay where I am in the Bay Area. But I do get that opportunity to teach people almost on a daily basis. I get to explain the science to the clients. I get to answer their questions. And they're extraordinarily smart people. And even if they don't understand science, they ask really good questions. And so I'm constantly getting that opportunity to teach people, which is fabulous. I love that. I am constantly challenged every single day. So another one of the things that really surprised me working in this litigation context is how hard it is. And I actually really like that. I really thrive. I know I stay up late at night thinking, how am I going to answer these questions? And my husband sometimes thinks I'm crazy, like, why are you working on the weekend on this issue? But it's really, to me, it's really fun, and getting challenged scientifically, but also getting challenged by the clients because they ask these extraordinarily tough questions. And my ability as a scientist has actually increased. I was really surprised by this, that I have become a better scientist working in this arena because of the level of rigor that is required and expected from environmental consultants working in the litigation realm in particular, not to diss environmental consultants working in other realms, but I think there's just so much additional scrutiny in the litigation realm that the level of rigor just has to increase just an additional notch. And so that was just really an unexpected thing that came out, that it's made me a better scientist, made me a better communicator, and that was truly, truly unexpected. I do occasionally get to do some cool field work. It's by no means what Dannique or Erin get to do, but it's usually some, ugly industrial facility. But I always find that interesting, just to get an opportunity to go on sites and just to see what other people do and how things work, and ask a zillion questions, because I'm just an inherently curious person, and that's what I love to do. So and one other thing I should mention is that often, because there's a litigation context, the projects that I get to work on are in the news, or you may have heard of, like Deepwater Horizon, or gosh, well, as a firm, we get to work on other large projects that you may have heard of. But me personally, I've gotten to work on Deepwater Horizon, which was, I was trembling with excitement when I got to work on that, because to get to work on a project that everyone's heard of and to be part of history was just really such an honor. I've gotten to work on Hinckley, the Erin Brockovich site, which was also an honor too. And so just amazing opportunities to get to work on these super famous projects. So how did I get here? I didn't really have a plan in life for what I was going to do. I went to Columbia University to get a Bachelor of Science. I started with chemical engineering because I liked chemistry, but this new department had just arisen, Earth and Environmental Engineering, and I really liked rocks. And so they had a lot of geology components in this program, and so I took a chance on it, and it was really a fabulous program. After graduating, I worked in consulting for a year at a company called Hart Krauser. I had interned in consulting as an undergrad, and also in the public space, but I thought consulting was more interesting. It was more diverse and just faster paced. I worked at Hart Krauser for a year. I did a lot of field work. We were actually dredging New York Harbor. So it was actually beautiful. I got to go out and stare at the Statue of Liberty and the New York Bay every day, which was quite an honor. But it did get a little boring after a while because it was the same project, the same routine every single day. And I also realized that to get ahead in environmental consulting, it really benefits you to have a graduate degree. So I moved out to Berkeley to get a master's, but I was open to a PhD. Both my parents have PhDs. Family of real science nerds here. And so I was having such a great time that I decided to stay on for my PhD at Berkeley. And I did a crazy thesis on understanding how microbes in the environment break down a certain type of flame retardant. And then in 2009, upon graduating, I joined Exponent, and I had explored the environmental consulting space, and I had sort of stumbled on Exponent. They had come to Berkeley to do a little seminar, and I just thought it was the most interesting because it was the most diverse. It's actually a multidisciplinary company. We do all fields of science and engineering, so I've gotten a chance to work on projects that involved other types of engineering. One of my first projects was investigating how foot bacteria cause odor in socks, which is totally random, but super fun. And so that interdisciplinary nature has been really interesting, which is why I joined. But there's been this unexpected, really, really great benefit of getting to work in the legal realm, where I'm constantly learning about the law and policy and really getting pushed to become a better scientist. So in terms of advice, it's a little hard for me to advise attorneys. I mean, if you do want to take this path, this is definitely a science pathway, and it really benefits you to have a graduate degree, particularly in the litigation support and to be an expert witness. There's kind of an instant credibility of having a PhD. You know, the Dr. Robrock just, you know, there's less explanation to do, although there are many, many people who have succeeded well in this area by having just a bachelor's or a master's degree. But definitely the science is required. But just kind of non-scientific things that I could recommend, you know, and everyone has said this before, the networking is key, saying yes to interesting opportunities that come. I definitely second all that. But there are a couple of things that people haven't mentioned that I think might be relevant. One is that even if you do decide to stay in the legal realm entirely, understanding science is really key. The best attorneys I've worked with have a pretty good grasp of science, and they don't have to have a scientific background. They've come from English or poli-sci backgrounds, but they have really soaked up all the science from consultants like me who've explained it to them over the years, And then they can ask me even harder questions than they could ordinarily. And so I strongly recommend to soak up all the science that you can from every possible source, be it classes or reading or just talking to consultants like me. And we're always happy to, at least I'm always happy to sit down and explain to people, and I've done this before, literally how to convert units from liters to meters cubed. I'm happy to do that. I love teaching. And another thing that I would recommend is to reach out for guidance. I get this opportunity every once in a while, and I love doing it. It's usually the child of one of my colleagues. They're like, hey, my son, daughter is thinking about going into environmental science. Can you help? And I will sit down for hours with these folks to help explain, what did I do? What do I see the opportunities to be? Just some thoughts and guidance. And just most recently, someone reached out to me looking to build their network, and I put them in contact with a bunch of people that I knew, and lo and behold, this girl was able to find an internship for the summer, and she's just absolutely thrilled. So really reach out to people and ask for guidance. Don't be afraid to do that. People love to help. So I found at least I've been able to help a lot of people, and I'm really, really happy about that. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we're largely at the end of the personal discussion, so I think we're onto the Q&A, but happy to answer any questions. And thank you again for this opportunity. It's been fabulous.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you all. This has been fascinating for me, for the participants. We do have some time for questions, so I will remind our participants that you can send those in using GoTo's question box. Send them as soon as you think of them, but we do have a good number to start out with. So the first question I will pose to the group, and again, to our panelists, any of you who want to answer or not answer each question, that works perfectly. So our first question today, a participant asks if there are substantial benefits to having a law degree in addition to a traditional graduate degree for long-term career opportunities in the field of environmental policy.
I'll tackle that. So it's very difficult for me to answer because I have a law degree, and so I took a very specific trajectory, and I do work a bit more in the international realm than I do in the national US realm. But I think it is really helpful. A lot of lawyers, particularly if you end up doing public interest work, you end up working with NGOs, you end up working in the policy space, and if that's where your interest lies, I think it can be really helpful and useful for you to do that. Having said that, I know there's a number of people that work in the NGO world that don't have law degrees, and so they will definitely, it's a viable track either way. But I think what is kind of helpful is to figure out sort of where in the environmental fields you want to be, and then work backwards from that. And so a lot of policy work really lifts off from legislation and legal systems in countries. And so having that background of a law degree, I think, is actually quite useful in the policy space. So, but again, that's my perspective, and I have a law degree, so I think sometimes it's who you ask is the answer that you get. So.
Thank you, Lisa. To our participant, I will also note that, of course, there's also master's degrees in environmental policy directly, if that's what you're interested in. That's what I did. It has served me very well, so there's just a bulk of opportunities out there for you. One of our participants asks a more general question, so anybody from the panel, please feel free to answer, which is that, do you see the field of environmental law changing substantially in the future?
I can take that. I think from my perspective, I think that in the immediate near future, I think if you're interested in climate change and sustainability, or ESG generally, that's pretty critical. I think it's important sort of in different, not only just in corporate transactional law, but just in the NGO world and in government. I just think that that's what I would consider to be sort of the, the next flavor of the day in terms of ice cream is for an environmental future. So I don't know if anyone else sort of has any viewpoints on that, but just from my perspective, that's where I see it. It used to be like fracking, and it just changes, obviously, but I think in the immediate future would be climate change and sustainability.
I would also add that, you know, we've seen, especially in the last few years, just this like national reckoning with racial injustice and all sorts of, you know, environmental justice issues. So I do see the field of environmental policy really shifting towards more explicitly acknowledging that history there and working very intentionally toward sort of dismantling these systemic processes and ways of working that perpetuate those issues and problems. So I see that as a really like an incredibly fast growing and critical field for folks to get some expertise and experience with.
Within, and not that I'm an attorney, but within kind of the toxic chemicals space that I tend to work in, what I'm seeing, I mean, there's a constant evolution of new chemicals that are introduced, but a lot of the tools are the same. And so there's a lot of the same laws and the same legal practices that people have applied for older contaminants. We still have there's an influx of new contaminants. And so, for example, PFAS, if you may have heard of that, or 1,4-dioxane or MTBE. So there's a constant evolution of which chemicals people are focusing on, but a lot of the tools that they're using as part of those litigation spaces remain the same. So there's some continuity, but there's some constant evolution as well.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Marissa specifically. One of our participants asks if there is any resources that you would recommend where participants can look up specific kind of environmental and land use reviews.
If you want to just like get exposure to what a CEQA document looks like or a NEPA document, I would seriously just Google. I would Google CEQA, NEPA. Like if you're interested in a particular sector, I would Google CEQA, NEPA, transportation, and all sorts of things will pop up in terms of environmental documents. There's various levels of review, and the largeness or smallness of a document typically depends on how controversial the project is. But there's all sorts of examples out there on the internet. The other place that I'd point you to is the OPR website. California has a clearinghouse where a lot of CEQA notices are posted. That's another place where you might look.
Thank you so much. And I will also plug that we will have a future summer school session later on this summer on land use specifically, and all are of course welcome to that. One of our participants asks if there is any aspects, and anyone on the panel is welcome to tune in here, of your positions that are not your favorite or that you find frustrating, and how do you embrace those challenges?
I mean, this is more general than specific, but I think one of the real challenges right now as somebody who cares about the direction of how we're going to deal with climate change and environmental issues is the swinging around that's going on. I mean, we went from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and now we're with Biden. It's meant some real losses, a great deal of choppiness in how we approach things. You know, if you're doing science, it needs a continuity and to get hold of basic issues to do the science, and that was broken up by, an administration that didn't like science very much. There's been some serious morale issues in the parts of the government that manage these issues, EPA, NOAA, which, people here have been there, other places. And I think, my biggest concern and frustration right now, and this is a more general societal issue than I think the question is directed at, but it is sort of related to how do you conduct yourself as a career person in these weird times. It is heartening that when Biden came in, almost the very first thing he did was affirm his support and his sense for the career people in the government, and basically, if you saw that little video he did, he started off saying, "Hey team." So he was talking about how he was there to work with them, to gain from them, to support them. But that is a very, very big challenge we face. Climate change is a continuous and very serious battle, and we can't afford it to be chopped up in bits and in 3.5 years from now go back to denial. So, you know, those are the frustrations I face.
I think I'll just chime in, and I did want to also mention, Caitlin, thank you for that, for the first question. I know Lewis and Clark does a master's in law, which is for people who don't have a JD, and I'm sure other schools have it, and that's 1 year. So I'm an LLM, so there are options as well if you want to do that. And then the second question, battery storage, I think is a really important area, and electricity transmission. I think battery storage and that kind of technology would be really a really interesting area for people. And as Lloydie has said, corporations themselves are going to have to start hiring climate expertise. And so I wouldn't be adverse to working in industry and doing that. And so to segue from that, I think because I've worked in climate change for so long, it can be extremely depressing. And the students are very passionate about it and also very worried about it, as they should be. And so I try really hard to, it's frustrating for me, but I try really hard to balance that line of telling people we are in serious trouble, but we have this very small window. And if we can seize this very small window, I try to look for windows of optimism where I can motivate people to actually make change. And I think that corporate transitions are one of those windows that are finally starting to open up. And so I think for lawyers who are willing to do that and work from the inside, it's really important. Like, it's a lot of my students are interested in public interest work and they want to work from the outside, and that's super important to push. But we actually need people on the inside doing this work too. Like, yeah, really, really important work. It's not easy to do that, but it's really important. I think the other area that I get frustrated with as well is the sort of insularity of the United States, not really realizing, particularly international climate change, the levels of poverty and inequity, both within the country, which I think finally people are paying attention to, but it can be sensitive and difficult as a person of color talking about those issues in predominantly white institutions. It's hard, I have to say, it's really hard. So I try to be very diplomatic about it, but also in the international realm, I start my international climate change classes by looking at economic inequality around the world and also in the United States. And so these are really sensitive issues to deal with, and I struggle. I'm not the best deliverer of the news, but I try really hard to deliver that news. And luckily, I think people are much more open and receptive to these issues, not only climate change, but racial inequality, economic inequality. And so I try to be hopeful, optimistic, and excited by seizing on that kind of passion.
Can I jump in on this one? So Lisa sort of gave my stump speech that I say all the time, right? So I am an environmental lawyer that's worked for industry my entire career. I'm also a Black woman who is the first generation of kids that didn't grow up in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. And so environmental justice and issues that are important to communities of color are very near and dear to my heart. And I tell people all of the time that one of the things that I've learned throughout my career is that if you get really, really good at this stuff and you can speak eloquently to these issues and you can frame up in a business context why the C-suite needs to do certain things in the context of sustainability, climate change, etc., they listen to you. They are well aware of the fact that these are the issues of our day. They are well aware of the fact that in order to conduct their business in a fashion that's conducive to success, they have to win in this space. And I always say, I feel like I have been able to affect so much change working from the inside. And we most definitely need to have all sorts of people working on all sides of these issues if we're going to tackle them successfully.
Thank you so much. Those were great answers. And we now have a question that I think is geared a bit more towards Lloydie. So parallel to the discussion of how having a science background affects work, for those of you who work in environmental law in ways that involve a lot of business or finance knowledge, when did you acquire these skills? Is it something you specifically studied in school, or is it something you can learn well on the job?
I think you just acquire those skills over time. To be honest, the more transactions you do, the more knowledge you gain, especially with respect to the finance side of things. I mean, just reading financial statements, balance sheets, trying to determine where the liabilities are hidden in a financial statements. Those are all things that the more you do, the better, the easier it gets. And I had an accounting background as an undergraduate, but it wasn't with the intention, as you know, of practicing environmental law, since I never intended to practice environmental law. But I do find that if there's an opportunity for those who are still in school to take some accounting or some finance courses, that would be very helpful. I can tell you that many firms, including Davis Polk, in the course of their training, they actually do a lot of training with respect to accounting and the like. So if you don't have that background, don't worry. I think you'll get it over time just by doing. And but if you do have the opportunity to sort of learn now, go ahead and take those courses. I think they would be very beneficial.
Thank you. We now have a more general question for anyone on the panel. Would any of you do anything differently in your career or make any different choices if you were starting out today?
I think I would have been a little easier on myself earlier in my career. Like told myself to be a little kinder, I during my master's just really like totally killed myself almost with like workload and things like that. And it just, yeah, just being kind to yourself, I think, is a good thing.
There were certainly times where I was asking myself why I was doing this, I mean, not every experience was 100% positive, but I just got lucky because it came together in kind of this interesting mosaic that, where one step informed another part of the step. And even now I, reach back into stuff I did a really long time ago that turns out to be pretty relevant to what I'm doing now. So it's very hard to answer that question.
I think, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
I think to echo some of this, when I was in private practice, I was one of those people that just didn't really think about big career changes. I'm a very, it's weird looking at my career so much, but I'm actually a person that likes stability in my career. And I just was not open to thinking about change at that point. And I wish I had done more research about what my options were. And so I would also say that at a point where I was so unhappy in corporate law, I really felt like a failure. Like I thought, like, I can do this job, I'm good at it, but I'm not happy. What's wrong with me? And it was only because I was so unhappy, it actually forced me to make a massive career change that I wasn't anticipating. And so I would say, you always have options, particularly with a law degree. It's a really good way to exercise those options and be open to them and think about what makes you happy. And all those sort of disappointments or what I thought were failures ended up like bringing me to a career that I'm really happy with. And so I think be easier on yourself. It's okay not to like a job, even though you think it's a job you should love, and then be open to switching if you're not happy, and really talk to people, think about career options. I didn't make time to think about career options, which is dumb because it's your career, it's your life, and it makes you happy or unhappy. And then I had this advice from a woman who was presenting at a conference. And she said, and I think this is really important, apply for the stretch jobs. I never did that. And I mean, I ended up doing it, but I think that's really good advice. So we are sometimes our own worst enemy about thinking about our own limitations and our own inabilities to do something. And everyone suffers from that kind of imposter syndrome. And so I think apply for the stretch job, be confident and apply, even if you don't get it. people read your CV, they'll interview you, you'll meet contacts, and who knows down the road where that will be beneficial. So.
Yeah,
I'll
I would
add
just
to that.
add really
Oh, go,
quickly
Lloydie. No.
that work-life balance is really important. And I have to tell you that I'm not the best person to talk about work-life balance. It's been really challenging. And if I had to do it all over again, I think I would sort of take that into account a little bit more. It's been hard. My two daughters think that, you know, they didn't see a lot of me, and they probably didn't as they were growing up. And it's been challenging from that respect. I can tell you that my daughter, who just finished law school, just told me that she doesn't want to practice being a lawyer just because she's seen what I have gone through, or at least at a minimum, she doesn't want to go to a law firm. So I just think even if you want to stay at a law firm, just think about other opportunities. I mean, take advantage of, to the extent that the firm has any sort of flex time policy or anything like that. I just don't sort of do what I do, which is just, work and work and work. It just, I really do think, work-life balance is critical just to everyone's happiness.
I want to say give yourself grace in that space as well, right? Like everybody doesn't want to stay at home with their kids, and that's okay, right? And I totally agree. Work-life balance is so important, but I'm the mom who told my kids in kindergarten, I'm never going to be the field trip mom. I just set the expectation on day one. And, maybe my daughter will say, I always want to be the field trip mom because I said that, but at least she knows she has the freedom to go either way, right? So I agree with everything that was just said. I know I made some wrong turns on being a workaholic, but give yourself grace to not be the stay-at-home mom. That's not for everybody either,
Thank you all. This is wonderful pieces of advice. I think we have a couple more minutes here just for some final questions. One participant asks, she says that she's interested in the field of international environmental law. Is there anywhere that any of you would recommend as a good place to start looking for her career?
I'd be happy to start with that. It depends on what kind of international environmental law you want to do. But I actually found when I started doing international work that it was so grounded in what I had learned in doing domestic environmental work. And that was just critical because I had a sense of reality about what could be achieved and what couldn't be achieved, what had been tried, what hadn't worked, what had worked. I was working in Russia at one point during the transition. They had these environmental law drafters that their job was to go out and look at all the laws across the globe and find the most advanced ones and draft them into Soviet law. But you had to have a need to know to even read the law in the Soviet Union. It wasn't accessible to everybody what that law looked like. So the laws had they had no function but what was on paper. And so when we started working with them, it was really important to be able to tell them, yeah, that law is really interesting, but very few countries have been able to actually achieve it or implement it. So I guess from my experience, I would get grounded domestically before I start engaging in the international part of it, because it's the domestic part is what gives you a concrete foundation to work off of.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it depends what you want to do. I think there is some fluidity between. There's either you work through the government and state departments, or you work in the NGO world. And so you can move between them. I think getting government experience is really helpful. I would start with internships with international NGOs and government departments, and really figure out the areas you want to work in. Climate change is very different from the negotiations on biodiversity, for example. So it depends which area you want to work in international environmental law. And you can. So when I started, I thought that travel and working in the international sphere was really exciting, and I traveled a lot. But travel is demanding, and so 10 years into that, I was like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. It's a lot of travel. It's also fascinating, but I would start doing internships at try the government side and try the NGO side, and then I think you'll figure out which sort of avenue you want to be involved in, because they're very different.
Perfect. Well, we are coming up right on time, so thank you so much to our participants for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. We hope you'll continue to think about the many opportunities and careers in this field. We're so grateful for your participation in ELI's annual summer school seminar series, and we do hope to welcome you all back for NEPA, ESA, and the fundamentals of environmental law next Tuesday. I want to extend a huge thank you to our fantastic panel, Dannique, Lisa, Marissa, Loyte, Erin, Ruth, and Kristen. You all have contributed so much. Thank you for lending your leadership to summer school and making it so spectacular. I hope you all take care and have a great summer.